when I was first asked to do this presentation, I wasn't sure what I wanted to approach, because in the planning stage, the late Jeff Greeno was still with us, and he was going to deal with some of the issues that now Dr. Gardner is going to talk about from a very different perspective. I'm not going to deal too much with the science. It dawned on me in putting this program together that we have been 20 years in the evolution of archaeological studies on the Menominee Reservation. Archaeologists might like to take credit for that, but actually it was foresters who made the major breakthroughs with discovery of the Joe Dick Road site, and we learned about how wrong we were about the way we were characterizing so-called pre-Columbian or pre-contact Menominee tribal members. So we learned quite a bit. For those of you who aren't conversant with the local geography, I'd like to point out that one of the things you can see from satellite imagery is the outline of the Menominee Reservation. You can see it up there, Ryan?
Yep.
Yeah. The way they manage their landscape, it shows up on satellite imagery. Wonderful. At the north end of this slide are Big and Little Bay de Noc, where the French supposedly first encountered members of the Menominee tribe. But they also ranged all along the west and east shores of Green Bay, the largest freshwater estuary in the country, down to the north end of Lake Winnebago, and of course all the way down to the Milwaukee River in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At one time, 10 million acres supposedly was under Menominee control before the treaty era. So what we're looking at, of course, is a very small portion of their original homeland, but still in the center of their traditional property. Now, next slide, please, Ryan. We're only going to cover the highlights. I can't do it in an hour over 20 years. There's a lot of detailed information that I'll summarize for you. The first work that was done here was actually done by the Indian agent, a fellow named Savage, who dug up some mounds, found some remains, human remains, and some copper tools. That was published by Dr. Walter Hoffman from the Smithsonian. From roughly 1895 to about 1918, 1920, there wasn't any archaeology going on, but there were literally ethnologists crawling all over the reservation trying to collect material culture, bags, pots, beadwork, quillwork, woodwork, sculpture. The philosophy of the ethnologists in the Smithsonian was that Native American culture was changing so rapidly, they were worried about loss of these technologies. So they were buying and collecting information to put in museums. As it turns out, much of that was problematical and is being resolved today. In the era, really two short periods, in 1918 and 1921, they shifted the emphasis from ethnology to archaeology. And give me the next slide, Ryan. Here's a picture of Dr. Walter Hoffman from the Smithsonian. He was a medical doctor And what he really came here for was to study the medicine lodge. When he got here, he realized there hadn't been much in the way of attention paid to the Menominee tribe. So he compiled this long ethnology published by the Smithsonian Institution in 1897. The only mention made of archaeology was a mound group. We don't know where it is. We think it might be Beaupre Lake, but we're not sure. And a rendition of a copper artifact that was found at that time. That's all we knew at the turn of the century. Wasn't much. Next slide, Ryan. It was really these three fellas. The gentleman with a good sense of humor on your left is John Valentine Satterley. He was a Menominee constable, but he was also instrumental in securing and selling to museum people artifacts, medicine bags, beadwork, sashes, all kinds of things, to institutions. The less humorous guy in the middle is good old Buck Skinner, who is well known for his shady dealings and kind of tricking people out of things to give him gifts and whatever. The fellow on the right is a chap who was the director of the Milwaukee Public Museum. So we had John Valentine Satterley, a traditional Menominee, supposedly, the Skinner and his colleague, Amos One-Road, from the Hay Foundation in New York, and the other fellow from the Milwaukee Public Museum collecting artifacts. So was Art Buckstaff at the Oshkosh Public Museum. So you had all these people out there collecting and putting things into museum collections. Next slide, Ryan. A long time passed with nothing done. Skinner was killed in a car accident out on the plains, collecting among the Iowa and some others. But what happened was that there was a radical shift in archaeology about this time, about 1992. The reason was that the tribe entered into litigation in the Fourth Court of Appeals in Chicago for usufruct rights to go off of the reservation and hunt and fish, collect plants. It kind of fell apart, but this was a major emphasis. And so 5 of us got together with various discussions about, is it really necessary to do the stuff that we were doing? How would it be used by the tribe? What would the benefits be? We came up with literally a conclusion that things were going to get much more complex. The Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Mr. Greeno, had already made claims under NAGPRA, Native American Graves and Protection Act, to return some of those remains to the tribe for reburial here on the reservation. That turned out to be pretty complex stuff. Some museums, for example, were very willing to give up everything just to clear space in their storage areas. Other museums, like the so-called expert anthropological archaeological committee at the University of Michigan, in response to his claim, gave him a 100-page document and said, "You think you're related? Prove it. Prove it by a preponderance of the evidence." It literally took us 20 years to get some of those remains back that were clearly culturally affiliated with the Menominee tribe. So there was a lot more in the way of administrative work to be done, study to be done, research to be done to meet the tribe's desires to repatriate their ancestors. That goes on today. Mr. Greeno notified me last week that the last 2 claims had been approved by the Office of Research at the University of Michigan. What the tribe does is handle them in a traditional way. They often have ghost suppers and then appropriate reburial ceremonies in their NAGPRA cemetery. So NAGPRA was a big issue. A second big issue was formal consultation under the guidelines of the National Historic Preservation Act. We're still not sure what formal consultation means, but it's a much more complex issue than it was before. So the last thing that was a problem was that many years ago, ARPA, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, was put into law, but it included the requirement that every tribe have a person who is qualified, having a graduate degree in anthropology, archaeology, or related field. How many tribes do you think had an anthropologist or archaeologist with a graduate degree in the early 90s? 2 or 3 that I know of, but that's about it. So there was another major issue involved. Next slide, Ryan. What we came up with were 3 separate institutional approaches to collecting and housing information that the tribe could use. The first was at College of Menominee Nation. Dr. Fowler, Chad Waukesha, myself, and the staff were part of the archaeological research team. Menominee Tribal Enterprises provided a lot of support with volunteers, with research, with access, and thirdly, the Logging and Cultural Museum housed all of the collections that were brought in not only from our work, but from other donors who would provide things. So finally, we had a structure of sorts that would help us move the tribe across that historic threshold. Because what happened when the tribe filed that litigation for usufruct rights, Wisconsin Attorney General hired Dr. Ronald J. Mason at Lawrence University, who was the grandfather of Great Lakes archaeology. I don't know what happened to him, but he must have been, I don't know what he was thinking. He said the Menominee just got off the turnip truck of history a couple generations before the French showed up. He based his conclusion not on any archaeological data, but on one Jesuit relation in Old French. The tribe, looking for, somebody who would provide an alternative, had the misinformation that I knew what I was talking about and hired me to contest his claim. And I went through all of the literature and said, you know what? We don't have the data. We just can't. There's no way that I can argue against what Mason has said. So in about 1992, 93, the tribe was literally disenfranchised, claiming their homeland was in Michigan. Most tribal members didn't like that much. They didn't accept that. They felt they had been in their tribal estate for thousands of years, and that's ultimately what we determined. In any event, we had real manpower out in the field, and we decided the best thing we could do would be to relocate the sites that were found by Baird and Skinner in 1918 and 1921. Half of them we couldn't even find. Most of them were poorly mapped. The credit goes to the foresters. Ran Walker, sitting back in the corner over there, and the late Jeff Greeno, who were out pounding the forest and finding these sites, helping us relocate them. As it turned out, we came up with very different conclusions than the work done in the 20s. Next slide, please. The first thing we did was make good maps. The Tribal Historic Preservation Officer called me and said, you know, the foresters have encountered some strange things out there in the forest. And what they had encountered was this village site on the upper left with over 300 surface depressions like those in the upper right that represented storage pits or earth ovens or cache pits. There were also, you see that little corrugated floor in the map we made? Those are garden beds. They weren't supposed to be here. But here they are in the flesh at the Joe Dick Road site. Subsequent work done by my son Ryan and Jeff Greeno has increased the number of storage pits to about 1,000. Now, this isn't a garden with your Uncle Sam and two cousins. This is a major undertaking. The garden beds and the storage facilities indicate to us a very different kind of adaptation than simply hunters and gatherers. These people had developed a sustainable agricultural system that was very complex, that lasted for at least 1,000 years and was still being used by some tribal members at the turn of the century. It's remarkable. Far and away different than anything that Buck Skinner and his colleagues contemplated in the 20s and 30s. Next slide, man. All right. One of the things that Dr. Gardner is going to talk about today is soils and stratigraphy. This is just one test excavation unit at the Joe Dick Road site that shows some very interesting things. On the top, you're going to see kind of a dark layer. That's a planting surface. Below that is kind of a brownish area that Bill identified as mixed fill. Below that is another planting surface. And then another layer of mixed fill. One of the grants I got from the Smithsonian was to a woman named Dolores Paperno. She's the tropical plant manager at the Smithsonian. I had sent her some samples from an upland site, and she said, well, you know, Dave, I'm a tropical plant person. I don't have any wild rice, but these are grass seeds. Were they growing wild rice? And I said, no, it's an emergent aquatic. This is an upland site. What we came to realize later on was that they were building their landscape, moving muck soils to increase the organic content of their agricultural zones. Pretty sophisticated stuff that they were doing that we had no contemplation about. We started looking at phytoliths, which are small plant particles that last almost forever, but they can identify maize, looking at squash residues. So we know at this point in these gardens they were growing corn or maize, squash, sunflower, probably chenopodium, and maybe beans, but beans are still a little bit iffy. They're hard to identify archaeologically. All built on top of the original landscape. So I can tell you it's pretty clear these tribal members were managing a landscape, building it, removing it, modifying it to their own needs. Much less different than the kind of approach we had to say, oh, all they want to do is go out and chase deer and fish. They spent a lot of time on this type of adaptation. Next. One of the things we've run into that's a real problem that we haven't been able to answer is that for about 1,000 years, the Menominee's ancestors manufactured pottery that was grit-tempered with very Baroque textile impressions, like the image on your left. About 900 AD, there's a dramatic shift to shell-tempered pottery rather than grit-tempered. There are two possible explanations. One is that women abandoned textiles because they were being pressed into much more service in the gardens, in land management, and harvesting. That's the position that's been put forth by David Ben, a former graduate, University of Wisconsin-Madison. The other modification, which is pretty simple, Alice Kehoe, one of my colleagues, Professor Emerita at Marquette University, says, Dave, it's real simple. They shifted their shell because it's better for manufacturing hominy. Maybe. Point is, we have yet to find an archaeological context where we can clarify this relationship. I just don't know what to tell you. We're low on the learning curve. Next slide. Philip Nakuti, in 1921, told Alonson Skinner, and the narrative is published, that when the Menominees made pottery, they tempered it with crushed shell and only made pottery on dry, sunny days. Maybe. We now know there are at least 10 major village sites scattered along the Wolf River, rather than small campsites that were envisioned by Barrett and Skinner and many others. Next. The time frame, roughly from about 750 AD right up into historic times and up to the turn of the century. We're in the process of running additional array of radiocarbon dates to fill these in. Now, Dr. Gardner and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. Keep in mind the slide you saw of the additions of mixed fill, and landscape modification. I'm not sure any of these dates date anything except the span of garden construction and use, because they're very active environments. You have people hoeing, hauling, moving, and it's easy for that charcoal to get mixed up and be out of sequence. But this gives you a good idea of the time span. Next. All right. We knew from the very outset that the Menominee Indian tribe lacked the capacity to do a lot of this research. So I was kind of given the responsibility of going out to try and get colleagues interested in this research. First fellow I talked to was Dr. Gardner, who did his doctoral dissertation on raised agricultural fields. Seemed very obvious. Dartmouth Laboratories, terrific facility, great stuff. Just as an example, give me the next slide. This is an image that was compiled by Dartmouth Laboratories, their GIS laboratories. This is a site known as ME61 on the Menominee River. You may or may not be aware that the tribe has been involved in consultation on the Back 40 mining site on the Menominee River. One of the issues has been, what's the destruction? And there's been a dispute about where the garden beds are and where they're not. This shows you beyond any equivocation that Michigan DNR and the mining interests are out to lunch. There's 3 miles of these raised fields that you can see very clearly on this drone-mounted precision LiDAR. Our early maps took us months to compile of garden beds. You're looking at something that's done in about a half a day. We don't have that technology. We're going out and soliciting that from others. Next slide, please. Here's another example. This is a photogrammetric image of the slope at Joe Dick Road that shows 3 hillside houses. You can see their depressions here on the bottom, and on the top is a profile that shows the dip. These have not been confirmed yet by excavation, but again, it's one of those new technologies that really gives us a different look at things. But what I can tell you is we've achieved our goal. We have brought the Menominee across history's threshold well back into archaic times about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. That has resolved most of the NAGPRA issues and has armed the tribe in being much more aggressive during their consultation with National Park Service, National Registry of Historic Places, and other issues that are important to them. So, thank you for your time. Thanks, buddy.
You can take a chair, but questions?
Questions?
We have time for questions.
Sure.
Did any of the early French describe the gardening in the ridges?
Yes. Both the French and the British talk about Menominee gardening. The general relations are quite terse. They're never very detailed. I think they were more inclined to mollify their superiors superiors in France been worried about how many Indians they converted to Christianity. If you believe their figures, some of them were baptized 10 or 20 times. Yes, sir. There you go.
Father Bondurant.
Ah,
Missionary.
Father Bondurant.
Yeah.
Yes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Those rows that were created, it seemed like they're very old. It's the ones that we could still see, and the ones that hadn't eroded away completely.
Well,
What's your thoughts on what's the age of those? The ones that have been from much farther ago. Can we even see the ones that were from 1,000 years ago, or that they completely eroded away?
my thoughts are that most of them have been destroyed by modern agriculture. But the Menominee tribe manages its landscape very different than, say, the National Forest Service. They don't do rock breaking. They don't prepare monotypical kinds of forestry. So most of them have been destroyed. One of the reasons the reservation is so unique is that you can see them on the surface. That also is true of the site along the Menominee River up in Michigan. Only two places I know of. Bits and pieces still survive, and maybe Dr. Gardner will talk a little bit more about the distribution of these garden beds. They range all the way from Georgia to here and down in South America as well. So and in Europe, they're a worldwide phenomenon. How they might differ, I don't know.